Okay, hi everyone. This is going to be my review of the HiFiMAN HE1000 planar magnetic headphone. So before I start, I just want to thank HiFiMAN for allowing me to be a part of this beta testing opportunity. So this is actually a beta unit, and I've been listening to it for the past month and a half-ish. The production unit so far, the only confirmed difference between this beta model and the production unit is that the headband is going to be shorter. So apart from that, I can't say that there's any official confirmation for differences between this unit and the actual production unit that people will receive. So without further ado, let's jump right into the sound quality. So as some of you guys know, I've been around the Head-Fi community for a while. I've been to the local Head-Fi meets. You've seen some of my videos, and I've had the opportunity to listen to a whole bunch of really awesome headphones and on really awesome rigs. To my ears, I think the HE1000 is actually one of the best flagship headphones out there. So that's a big accomplishment by HiFiMAN. So that's the short summary. Going on to the long, in-depth review of the HE1000. Let's start off with the bass. So this is a planar magnetic headphone, and like most planar magnetic headphones, it has really excellent bass extension. So it can hit the low notes really easily from 20 hertz and above up to about 250 hertz for the bass area. The HE1000 produces those sounds no problem whatsoever. So an interesting thing about this headphone is that when you have these on your head, they make bass sounds, and then the weird thing is if you take them off your ears just a little bit, like maybe half an inch or so, it actually makes the bass become more subwoofery, how it comes reverberant in your head. It's a really interesting thing. I think that has to do with both the planar magnetic headphone design, driver design, as well as their what they call window shade grill system here. It used to be called like Blind's grill, but I think the translation got changed. So you can see right here in the ear cup that there are some lines there, and I think that's part of the window shade system, and that connects to the outside as well. So if you're listening to the HE1000, if you have the ear cups facing towards you, like so, you actually get more of the bass frequencies if you're just having this off your head, listening to it like kind of like a speaker. So you do get more bass frequencies coming out towards your ear this way. If you rotate the ear cup so that the outside grill is facing you instead, you don't get as much of the bass frequencies, and instead you get more of the high frequencies. So I think their window shade system has to do something with how the bass is reproduced when you have this on your head. And I thought that was an interesting aspect to consider. I've never heard that kind of response before, where it's pretty bassy on one side of the ear cup and then it's not as bassy on the other side. So I think their window shade system does something with how the air moves within the ear cup. Pretty interesting overall. So the bass as a whole sounds good. I think it's not as fast as I've heard in other flagship headphones though. So what I mean by faster is that when you're playing music and you're hearing the bass notes, the transients that come and go, especially for like electronic music where beats can come really fast, the HE1000, for some reason, I find it to not be able to keep up with those transients quite as well as other headphones I've heard. So that kind of makes the bass a little bit woolly sounding, so it's a little bit slurred in terms of different bass notes being able to be distinguished from one another. I find that to make the HE1000 sound a little soft in terms of detail retrieval in the bass region because of that. It's not too big of an issue, I guess, as a whole, but it's just something that I noticed coming up from other flagship headphones and of course my STAX electrostatic headphones. So I thought that was kind of weird because this is a planar magnetic design, so it has very strong magnets moving the diaphragm back and forth, and it is a very, 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 very thin design of the diaphragm, which is in the nanometer thickness. So I was kind of surprised to hear the bass sounding a bit slow, because I was expecting the strong planar magnetic forces being able to drive the really, really, really thin diaphragm pretty quickly. But I guess listening to the headphone myself, it's not quite the case, so that was kind of weird. Moving on to the, actually I should mention that I think the bass is a little bit boosted on the HE1000. It's done in a tasteful way, though it's not overly done in some headphones. It's not anemic sounding like in other headphones. It's kind of in between boomy and thin. So it is a nicely done bass in terms of its slight boost. It is very engaging, and it's easy to get into the music with the bass response that the HE1000 has. Okay, so with that said, moving on to the mid-range now, which is from about 251 Hertz to about 6,000 Hertz. So from that range, I think this is a little bit where the HiFiMAN kind of, the HE1000 kind of is a hit or miss for some people. So I mentioned that the bass is warm, so the bass kind of bleeds into the mid-range as well. So the mid-range has a nice, the lower mid-range I should say, has a nice kind of lush sound, very full, and it makes certain sounds, especially like male vocals and piano notes, really sound nice and have good timbre. It also, that the lower mid-range region is also where a lot of the fundamental harmonics are for various instruments, so it makes instruments have a good timbre overall with the slight warmth there. However, once you start moving into the upper mid-range, things start to get a little bit weird for me. From the 4 to 6 kilohertz area, which is the upper mid-range, I think things sound a little bit too bright for me. And then at the kind of lower upper mid-range, so like the 1 to 3 kilohertz region, things sound a bit subdued. So when you're listening to the mid-range as a whole, it starts off warm at the lower mid-range, and then it gets kind of subdued in the kind of lower upper mid-range, and then it gets a bit bright at the upper mid-range. So it's a kind of weird effect, for me at least to listen to, because the lower mid-range does sound very nice, and then you kind of move on to the rest of the mid-range and it sounds a bit laid back. So for certain recordings, I think that effect is really nice, because in the 1 to 3 kilohertz region, there are mastering things that can happen in music, and that area tends to get a bit boosted, which makes some things seem more forward. And with the HE1000 having that kind of subdued frequency response, it makes that area not as shouty and bright, or not bright, it makes it less shouty and a little bit more subdued. So I mean, when I mean subdued, I'm talking about laid back sound, and because of that laid back sound, it makes it less fatiguing to listen to. So for those kinds of sounds, the HE1000 does a great job at making those recordings sound nice and relaxing and not aggressive in your face, because of that. However, once you move up to the upper mid-range, from like the 5 kilohertz to the 7 kilohertz region, so moving kind of into the treble, the HE1000 does sound bright to me, and a little bit fatiguing. So even though the lower upper mid-range is not fatiguing, the upper mid-range and lower treble is fatiguing. So when I'm listening to music, it's kind of weird, especially for like Michael Jackson, because he has very great range of vocal range. So it can reach really low notes and really high notes into the female vocal range. So it's kind of interesting to hear the HE1000 in that regard. because the lower mid-range does have the really good warmth in it, which is nice for Michael Jackson's lower notes. But then once you start reaching his more raspy and high-pitched notes, it doesn't sound as pleasant with the HE1000 because of the upper mid-range and lower treble area sounding fatiguing to me. So it sounds a little bit harsh to my ears. In Ottervana Plus and Audacity, or anything that supports the Apple Audio Unit equalizer options, I've decreased the 8 kilohertz region by 2.8 decibels. I've reduced the 6.3 kilohertz region by 2 decibels, and I reduced the 5 kilohertz region by 1 decibel. And I found that to reduce the shouty or bright response of the HE1000 such that it doesn't sound fatiguing to my ears. So if you're listening to the HE1000, I suggest trying to give that equalizer a try, and maybe it'll sound a little bit less bright to your ears. It did for mine at least, and I much prefer it with the EQ. So with that being said, moving on to the treble. This is a planar magnetic headphone, and I found that over the years that planar magnetic headphones kind of have a problem area in the treble, and that they sound pretty hot overall, either really sizzly like in the HiFiMAN HE500, or a bit subdued like in the LCD series, LCD 2, 3, somewhat the X. So the HiFiMAN HE1000, it kind of has a grainy sound overall still, but it's not, what do I call it? It's not sizzly like the other HiFiMANs that I'm used to. Compared to the HE560, I don't think the HE1000 is as grainy, so it is less grainy than that. Compared to the HE500, definitely I like the treble on the 1000 better because it doesn't have the giant 9 to 10 kilohertz spike in the frequency response that I really hate in the HE500. So, but overall, I still think the HE1000's treble is kind of grainy. What I mean by grainy is that when you're listening to something like a snare drum or cymbal or hi-hat or anything that has a lot of the upper frequency response, I find that it produces a little more details than it should. And again, kind of like mentioning the speed of the diaphragm, just like I did for the bass, I think the treble is not quite fast enough to keep up with some transients, so it does end up sounding a bit blurred, and because of that blurriness, I find that it sounds a little bit grainy because it can't keep up with those transients and be able to reproduce those details properly. So as a whole, in terms of the frequency response, wow, it's already 13 minutes and not even at Soundstage yet. So in terms of the frequency response, I think the HiFiMAN HE1000, it sounds pretty nice overall. I'd say it's one of the better headphones out there that I've heard in terms of frequency response and having nothing too major in terms of its response. I did mention the upper mid-range, lower treble kind of problem area and the bass sounding a bit slow, but those are pretty minor issues compared to other headphones that I've heard. So overall, even though I did nitpick a little bit about the HE1000 there, I still think it's one of the better headphones that I've heard. Okay, so a lot of people have been talking about the Soundstage of the HE1000, and it's a very interesting experience to listen to. When you put these on, the sense of Soundstage, so kind of how big the room is that the sounds are coming from, the HiFiMAN HE1000 seems to make the room pretty darn large. It's not like the HD800 where it's just extremely wide, but it also has height. Not as much as the STAX, but it does have height, and it does have pretty good depth. So it's what I call a cuboid shape, where it's a pretty long width, decent depth, and okay height. So it is a kind of box-shaped soundstage. When you're listening to this, it's kind of a weird experience because most headphones don't have that kind of soundstage, but it is very interesting to hear because it does sound very big and open in that regard. So the soundstage of the HE1000 is pretty big. I find it to be unnaturally big, but combined with music and when I'm talking about the instrument separation and imaging later in this video, it really blends everything pretty nicely as a whole. For some people it might be weird, just like the HD800 is weird for me, but a lot of people like that. But I actually like the soundstage of the HE1000. So with that being said, I mentioned the imaging and instrument separation. So instrument separation to me is how separated in terms of being a solid image is this instrument from this instrument. So because I've mentioned earlier that the HiFiMAN HE1000 does sound a bit slow, especially in the bass frequencies, I find that its instrument separation is not quite that awesome, but it's good overall. What I mean by good is that it's able to keep images kind of separated, but it's not completely a solid image. So it's not like this instrument is definitely right here. It's kind of more like this instrument is kind of in this general area, and it's a little bit slurred between the image over here. So it's not quite able to keep up with instrument separation for me, but it is still one of the better headphones that I've heard for instrument separation. So talking about separation and soundstage, combining those two terms into what I call imaging, which is where instruments are placed around your head, or how separated instruments are within the soundstage, basically. I find that the imaging of the HE1000 as a whole is kind of weird because of the large soundstage that I think sounds artificial, but it's pleasing to listen to. I find that images are more spread out along the edges of the soundstage. So I mentioned that cuboid shape, so it's more on the left and right sides as well as front and back. So I find that images are more placed around the edges there in that regard, that cuboid shape. It's a little bit interesting to hear because when you're listening to the HE1000 initially, you're amazed by the soundstage, the size of the room. And then if you listen to it more closely, you'll notice that the images, although they may not be like in a circular pattern, instead it's more in this box shape. You'll find that instruments are pretty layered as a whole. It might be because the images are on the sides of the soundstage. That's just my theory. But you'll find that the instruments are kind of separated nicely in terms of layering. So the instruments over here are nicely layered behind the instruments over here, which are nicely layered behind the instruments in the back. So you'll get that kind of effect when you're listening to the HE1000, and it's a really cool thing to experience. I've had a few people that I've talked to, and they say that the HE1000 sounds like you're listening to speakers in that regard. And I can kind of see where they're coming from. The instrument layering is very nice, similar to what you kind of get with a speaker. But because the soundstage is so oddly shaped in size, I think it kind of doesn't make it sound like I'm listening to speakers, but I can definitely see why people would think that gives you the sense of this large room that you're playing music in. So that's one of the cool effects of the HE1000. I think it's a coloration, but it's a really interesting coloration that I've never heard in any other headphone before, and I think it's an interesting experience just to listen to. Okay, so 19 minutes and a half. As a whole, I think the HiFiMAN HE1000 is a great headphone. Despite all of my nitpicks that I've mentioned throughout this video, I do think it's a really awesome headphone. If you can, I would highly suggest trying this out before you buy it, because not just like the HD800, it might be nice for some people, it might not be nice for others, especially for the soundstage and the imaging effects. I think that's a little bit of the weird thing for me, in terms of how the HE1000 sounds. The frequency response is kind of a secondary problematic area for me, especially the bright area of the 5 to 7 kilohertz region. But I mean, you can EQ that. I don't think you can EQ the soundstage of the HE1000. So listening to the HE1000, it's a really unique experience for me to hear. In terms of what I've been using gear-wise, I've been mostly using the Light Harmonic or LH Labs PulseX Infinity headphone, which does have the 4-pin XLR output as well as the single-ended output. So the cable on the HE1000, it's configured with these 2.5 millimeter jacks. Not sure if the camera will focus on that. But basically, when you have the 4-pin XLR jack, it will have plus right, plus left, minus left, and that will be driven by the 4 pins of the amplifier, the 4-pin output XLR. If you're using single-ended, it will have plus, oh, this is left, plus left, and then ground, and then right plus and ground. So it's not going to be the differential signaling that you get from a XLR output. I found that honestly the HE1000 sounded pretty much like the HE1000 no matter which setup I was on. There were 2 cases where I've listened to it on a tube amp, and I thought it both of them had great synergy. So one of them was from the last HeadFi meet, and that was the Xanadu by Eddy Current, and that's a tube amplifier. And I'm not sure what the output impedance is of that amp, but planar magnetic headphones are immune to the output impedance effect. So even if it was 500 ohms, it wouldn't have an effect on the frequency response of the HE1000. But just synergy-wise, I think the Xanadu had a great synergy with the HE1000. Instead of having kind of the wide soundstage, it made the soundstage a little bit narrower. So it made the center imaging a little bit more clear and well-defined in terms of that regard. But I honestly do think that the HE1000 just sounds pretty much like the HE1000 no matter which setup you're on. And that's one of the cool things about the HE1000 is that they're pretty efficient overall. I mean, you can drive them from an iPhone just fine. But of course, it's not going to sound as great compared to a dedicated desktop setup. So overall, I think the HiFiMAN HE1000 is easy to drive. I think it pairs wonderfully with the LH Labs PulseX Infinity, especially on the femtoclock time mode. That's just awesome with the HE1000 in terms of getting the imaging around the soundstage. So, okay, so we're at 23.5 minutes, and I wanted to compare the HE1000 to my STAX headphones, the entry-level STAX SR-207. Wow, this is a long video. So I compared to the STAX, I've been using the LH Labs PulseX Infinity because that's the only balanced headphone amplifier that I have, and all STAX headphones are balanced by nature. So they have a 5-pin jack here. It'll be plus right, plus left, minus left, and the bias for the drivers. And that's the telephone. So compared to the STAX, I think the HiFiMAN HE1000, it's a different flavor in sound. So I find that the HE1000 is more of a warm sound overall with the large soundstage, and it sounds like you're listening to music in a large room. The STAX seem more on the, I would call, neutral, uncolored side. It has a more accurate soundstage and more accurate imaging. So when I'm playing back, some audio recordings like this one where I'm using the binaural mics and I know exactly where images and the soundstage are supposed to be and how big the soundstage is supposed to be, I find that the STAX do a much better job at the imaging and soundstage aspect. However, if I'm listening to music and I just want to sit back and relax, I think the HE1000 is a better headphone in that regard. But there are different flavors of sound, and honestly, I'm looking for a more accurate monitor when I'm listening to headphones, so I prefer the STAX SR-207 over the HE1000. But for music and for most people, I think the HE1000 would be a better choice overall. In terms of the speed, this is what I mentioned before. The HE1000 sounds a little bit slow to me. It might be, I don't know, some people have speculated that the diaphragm, the nanometer thin diaphragm, is not as tensioned as it should be. So that could introduce a speed factor in terms of driving the diaphragm. If it's too loose, then it might be a little bit hard to get the full size of this diaphragm, which is huge, to move all at once. In terms of the STAX, I know STAX has been doing these headphones for years, so they've got their technology nailed down really well. I think they have the right tension in their driver, and so for me, the SR-207 sounds much faster than the HE1000 does. It's able to keep up with music transients a lot better. So that's why I prefer the 207 in terms of monitoring, especially for things like when I do binaural recordings. Keeps up with the transients a lot better, the 207, compared to the HE1000. And that's the biggest factor for me in terms of the comparison between the two. Frequency response aside, I think the 207 does a much better job at reproducing sounds as accurately as possible for my recordings. For the HE1000, again, I think for music it sounds just fine. I've compared the HE1000 to the STAX SR-009, the top of the line STAX headphone, out of the Blue Hawaii amp. And in terms of speed, I found them to actually sound pretty similar overall. The STAX are a little bit faster than the HE1000, but comparing the two side by side, I think both sound spectacular. So personally, I still like the SR-207. It keeps up with the transients, and that's what I like about it the most compared to the HE1000. Frequency response wise, the STAX sound a little bit shoutier, especially in the 1 to 3 kilohertz region where the HiFiMAN is subdued in that area. So in terms of when you're listening to music, the SR-207 sounds a bit shouty, whereas the HE1000 sounds a bit laid back and more relaxing. Some people provide the term forgiving. So that's kind of how the HE1000 sounds. It's a bit forgiving. It lets you go into the music even if it's badly mastered and really just enjoy it. So that is my almost 30-minute long review of the HiFiMAN HE1000 headphone. Again, I want to thank HiFiMAN themselves a lot for letting me have this opportunity of listening to the beta pre-production unit of the HiFiMAN HE1000 for the last month and a half-ish. It was really a great opportunity for me to get a feel as to how the hi-fi, I guess, industry is evolving. Fang Bian at HiFiMAN is developing this awesome nanometer thin diaphragm technology for the HE1000, as well as having the patent pending window shade system for their driver. So I think HiFiMAN is doing a really great job at innovating the field of full-size, high-end headphones. And I really look forward to see what they come up with in the future in terms of how this technology evolves. So thank you very much for watching this really long review. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below. Otherwise, I'll talk to you guys later.